Ever wondered how Viking funerary practices influenced cultures across different regions? It's a question that might not have crossed your mind, but once pondered, it opens up a world of fascinating insights about the Vikings and their impact on the world. The Vikings, known for their daring sea voyages and fierce warrior culture, were also deeply spiritual, and this spirituality was profoundly reflected in their funerary customs. These customs, rich in symbolism and ritual, offer us a unique window into the Viking world, providing a deeper understanding of their beliefs, values, and social structures. Crucially, these practices were not confined to the Viking homeland of Scandinavia. As the Vikings ventured out into the world, their cultural practices, including their funerary customs, traveled with them, influencing and being influenced by the cultures they encountered. This cultural exchange is evident in the archaeological sites scattered across Scandinavia, England, and Eastern Europe, each telling a compelling story of shared traditions, adaptations, and transformations. Dive into the coexistence triad, where we explore mutual influences across distinct regions. Here we set our sights on the fascinating world of Viking funerary practices, specifically how they manifested in the disparate locations of Oseberg and Gokstad in Scandinavia, Sutton Hoo in England, and the Black Grave in Eastern Europe. Despite the geographical separation, these sites bear a striking resemblance to each other in their burial customs. This is no mere coincidence. Instead, it underscores a shared cultural and symbolic understanding of the afterlife and the importance of maritime life. The boat, a significant symbol in Viking culture, often features in these burial practices, serving as both a physical vessel and a spiritual metaphor for the journey into the afterlife. In Oseberg and Gokstad, we see this maritime symbolism in the form of elaborate boat burials, reserved for the elite. These ceremonies were grand affairs, with the deceased placed in boats alongside a wealth of grave goods, and in some instances, even sacrificial victims. This practice underlines the significance of the sea in Viking life and death. Across the sea in England, the Sutton Hoo burial site echoes these practices, albeit with a local twist. Although the boat is still present, the grave goods are less ornate, reflecting a fusion of Norse customs with Anglo-Saxon traditions. This blend of practices underscores the adaptability of the Vikings and their influence on local traditions. Further east, the Black Grave in Eastern Europe presents another variation of the boat burial. While still maintaining the central theme of maritime life, the practices here incorporate local elements, signaling the reach of Viking influence through their extensive trade and migration routes. In essence, these sites form a triad of mutual influence. The funerary practices in each region, while unique in their own right, reflect a shared cultural understanding, painting a vivid picture of a connected Viking world. This triad showcases the shared cultural practices across these regions, painting a picture of a connected Viking world. Let's examine the reinforcement triad, which suggests a domino effect in the spread of Viking funerary customs. Starting in the cradle of Viking civilization, we see the heart of their funerary practices in the Scandinavian sites of Oseberg and Gokstad. Here, the boat burials, rich grave goods, and even sacrificial victims illustrate the Vikings' core values and their spiritual understanding of the afterlife. These rituals were potent symbols of mobility, power, and spiritual journeys reserved for the elite of Viking society. This cultural tapestry then weaves its way to England, specifically to the site of Sutton Hoo. The practices observed here, while echoing those of Scandinavia, are less ornate. It's a fascinating blend of cultural interaction and adaptation, underscoring the Vikings' influence on local traditions. Sutton Hoo reflects a fusion of Norse and local customs, illustrating the Vikings' adaptability and their capacity to influence and integrate with other cultures. Finally, the reinforcement triad brings us to the eastern reaches of Viking influence, the Black Grave in Ukraine. Here we see further adaptations of Viking funerary customs, reflecting the influence of the practices at Sutton Hoo. The Black Grave site is a testament to the extensive reach of Viking cultural practices, even as it incorporates local Eastern European elements. In this sequential journey from Scandinavia to England and then to Eastern Europe, we can trace the footprints of Viking funerary customs. Each region, while maintaining its own unique elements, carries echoes of the practices that came before it. This sequential influence paints a dynamic picture of cultural exchange and adaptation. The reinforcement triad, therefore, is not just about the spread of specific practices, it's about the flow of ideas, the intermingling of cultures, and the lasting impact of the Vikings far beyond their Scandinavian homeland. It's about how these practices, born in the heart of Viking civilization, resonated across vast distances, leaving their mark on diverse cultures and societies. The reinforcement triad presents a fascinating progression of cultural influence across these regions. Now, we explore the causal and nonlinear triads that delve into direct and indirect influences respectively. Firstly, the causal triad represents the direct influences that took place from the Scandinavian sites of Oseberg and Gokstad to Sutton Hoo in England, and then on to the Black Grave in Ukraine. These influences, however, were not simple carbon copies of one another, but rather they were imbued with regional variations. For instance, Sutton Hoo reveals an Anglo-Saxon interpretation of Viking funerary customs, presenting a fusion of local and Norse traditions. Similarly, the Black Grave in Ukraine exhibits a unique blend of Viking practices with local Eastern European elements. This mix of cultural influences illuminates the adaptability of the Vikings and their ability to meld their customs with those of the regions they encountered. Shifting our focus to the nonlinear triad, we delve into more complex indirect influences. These are not straightforward one-to-one exchanges, but rather they involve intricate paths of cultural transmission. Imagine the Viking traditions originating in Scandinavia and reaching Ukraine through a complex network of trade and migration routes. These practices didn't just hop from one region to the next, but rather they meandered, evolved, and adapted along the way. Similarly, the Viking influences that reached England were not solely from direct contact with Scandinavia. They also arrived indirectly, shaped by shared experiences of Viking expansion and interaction with other cultures. In essence, the causal and nonlinear triads provide us with a richer understanding of the spread of Viking funerary practices. They reveal not just the direct influences from one region to another, but also the nuanced, indirect connections that formed through complex networks of trade, migration, and cultural interaction. These triads highlight the intricate web of Viking influence, both direct and indirect, across these regions. Finally, we delve into the inclusive and conjoined triads that suggest comprehensive influence and interdependent development. The inclusive triad paints a picture of a cultural tapestry, woven from threads of influence from each site. It's as if each site is a chapter in a grand narrative of Viking-era burial practices. Let's start with the comprehensive influence of each site on the others. The Scandinavian sites of Oseberg and Gokstad, with their elaborate boat burials, undoubtedly set the stage. Their practices were mirrored, albeit in a less ornate fashion, in Sutton Hoo in England. These shared customs, such as the inclusion of grave goods and the symbolic importance of the boat, suggest a shared cultural understanding of the afterlife and the importance of maritime life. But it's not a one-way street. The practices in Sutton Hoo, in turn, influenced those at the Black Grave site in Eastern Europe. And the Black Grave site, with its unique regional variations, reflected back on both Oseberg, Gokstad, and Sutton Hoo. This reciprocal influence helps us to understand the Viking-era burial practices as a dynamic, evolving tradition, shaped by cultural interchange and adaptation. Now, let's move on to the conjoined triad. It suggests an interdependent development of practices at these sites. The development at Sutton Hoo, for instance, may be seen as a result of the practices at Oseberg and Gokstad. And yet, Sutton Hoo's practices later influenced those at the Black Grave site. It's like a cultural feedback loop, where each site is both influenced by and influences the others. This interdependence underscores the interconnectedness of these regions during the Viking era. It tells us that the development of Viking funerary practices was not a solitary endeavor, confined within geographical borders. Instead, it was a collective project shaped by the shared experiences and mutual influences of these diverse regions. These final triads underscore the interconnectedness and interdependence of these regions in the evolution of Viking funerary practices. As we journeyed through these triads, we've seen how Viking funerary practices influenced and were influenced by the practices in different regions. The interconnectedness of these practices tells a compelling story of cultural exchange, adaptation, and mutual influence that spanned across Scandinavia, England, and Eastern Europe during the Viking era. The coexistence triad showed us the shared cultural and symbolic understanding of the afterlife across geographically distinct sites. The burial customs of Oseberg, Gokstad, Sutton Hoo, and the Black Grave all bore similarities, reflecting a shared cultural reverence for maritime life and the afterlife. The reinforcement triad took us on a journey of cultural progression, revealing how the practices seen in Oseberg and Gokstad likely influenced those in Sutton Hoo, which in turn could have impacted the practices at Black Grave. This domino effect demonstrated the spread and evolution of Viking funerary customs. The causal and non-linear triads allowed us to explore direct and indirect influences. We saw how Scandinavian practices directly influenced those in England and Ukraine, but with regional variations. We also learned how indirect connections through complex trade and migration routes allowed the Viking traditions to reach far and wide. The inclusive and conjoined triads revealed a comprehensive, interdependent picture of Viking-era burial practices. Each site contributed to a richer understanding of these practices, with each site influenced by and influencing the others in various ways. The development at one site was seen to be dependent on the practices at the others, creating a fascinating web of cultural interchange. In a sweeping narrative of Viking influence and cultural interchange, the regions of Scandinavia, England, and Eastern Europe each weave a distinct yet interconnected tale. The Vikings' adaptability, their influence on local traditions, and their cultural spread through expansion and trade networks are all vividly illustrated in their funerary practices. This exploration of Viking funerary practices sheds light on the rich tapestry of cultural exchange and influence that marked the Viking era.